So, if you're here, that means you've seen this statistic that I have on the screen. 1 in 4 alcohol bottles. So that is an alarming statistic, and behind that is an equally alarming story that we're going to present to you today. But I also thought I'd tell you some more stories. For example, blood diamonds, which you've also probably heard of, called conflict diamonds, continue to be mined in war zones. They're often harvested on the back of forced labor or child labor, used to fund militias, armed rebels, government troops, and this is a problem that persists. Illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. Have you heard that story? You know, it's an example of an illicit trade that not too many people are aware of, but illicit, illegal fish products are making their way into our supply chain and into our stores, even here in the United States. How about tobacco? Tobacco trade is rampant. Perhaps it's the most widespread of all of the different forms of illicit trade. So while most of the policy attention is on the traditional cigarette, we also are seeing that illicit trade is being taken in the forms of the new electronic cigarettes and the vaping and the heat not burn technologies that the companies are introducing. How about pharmaceuticals? Just 2 weeks ago, Interpol finished up another one of their programs. Police raids in 116 countries netted 500 tons of illicit pharmaceuticals, most of them that are available online. So now it's not just the old traditional way of getting these illegal products into the hands of people, but now they're taking advantage of the online tools, marketplaces. Annual retail in logging, up to 157 billion. Pesticides, 25% of the global market, illegal. 133 billion in fuel. That was one for me that was, I went to a conference in Geneva about 6 months ago, and we had, I think there were 30 different governments that were there talking about the illicit trade in petroleum and petroleum products. And I think everyone's heard the story about counterfeiting and piracy. I mean, that's where a lot of the work has been done, the famous Gucci bag stories and Rolex watches and Nike tennis shoes. But as you can tell from this story and the story that Monica is going to tell a little bit later, it's a lot more than just counterfeiting and piracy. In fact, that is why we created TRACIT, was to look at all of the different industries that were vulnerable or are vulnerable to illicit trade. And you can see this is an infographic of the 12 different sectors that we're working in now. So we're taking on illicit trade in a holistic way because we think that acting together is a possibility for us to address the common vulnerabilities in each of these sectors. You might say, well, pesticides and alcohol have nothing in common, but they do have a lot in common, the way that the illicit trade is carried out. And as you can see, it's the traditional air, land, and sea transport. It's small packages that come to your doorstep from FedEx. It's all of the internet platforms, and not just the traditional ones like Amazon or Alibaba, but it's also the social networks like Facebook or Instagram, the places that my daughter is every day. In fact, she comes to me when she finds fake tennis shoes on Instagram and says, "Look what I found." But it's also taking advantage of weak border control and gaps and corruption in customs, which is something that we're really doubling down on right now, is looking at the corruption at the border, free trade zones. So that's a little bit of why we created TRACIT across the industries, what we're going to do, which is addressing the common vulnerabilities. Also in this area of business, and from what I can tell from the registration, there are a lot of you that are working in addressing the associated crimes. Right alongside illicit trade is the financial fraud, the money laundering, the human trafficking, the forced labor, and the corruption. And finally, we put TRACIT together to take all of these this industry expertise and to concentrate on these common vulnerabilities and to drive an international policy agenda. And here's this slide right here is just the 6 intergovernmental and regional organizations that we're currently working with right now with projects in the pipeline trying to move forward on this. All of these organizations and more. In fact, the first study that we did of all the UN family, we found no fewer than 20 international organizations that have some responsibility for illicit trade. So one of our primary objectives is to work with them. And finally, then to promote our common policy solutions. Some of you who are in this area may have seen a report that we published just a few months ago with The Economist, where we did a index where we evaluated 84 countries on their abilities to defend against illicit trade. And from that process, we've been going around, I think, 13 governments, 13 countries. So far, we've been sitting down with government officials and sharing with them what we think are the top priorities. And this is sort of the minimum to-do list if you're a government that's trying to fight illicit trade. So let's get back to alcohol here. What we have are a pretty powerful, pretty important report that's shedding a lot of light on the problem. And as you will see in the from Monica's presentation and in the report that we're going to make available, it also sheds some light on what some of those potential solutions are. And the solutions are critical because even if you just put it in context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, illicit trade touches on all 17 of the goals in one way or another. But in the case of illicit alcohol, it specifically impacts these 4 of the UN SDGs. And if we're going to be successful in achieving the 2030 agenda, then we need to make sure that illicit trade isn't working against us when we do that. So what I'd like to do now is move into the presentation of the report. And following that, we're going to have some guest speakers and a panel discussion, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. So with that, I would like to introduce Monica Ramirez here. Monica is the Global Director of Corporate Affairs and Regulatory and Public Policy at Anheuser-Busch InBev. So you've all probably had an ice-cold bottle of Budweiser or an ice-cold Stella Artois, one of my favorites. So you may know that AB InBev is the world's largest brewer with over 500 brands of beer to choose from. Let that sink in. Sold in more than 100 companies. So we're really pleased to have a corporation like AB InBev getting behind this. Monica has been fighting this fight for 7 years in one way or another at AB or the predecessor of SAB Miller. And before that, she was a partner law firm on international trade and investment in Bogota. So I'm pleased to invite Monica for this also for one more reason, is she's the thought leader behind this report. She's the one who said this is eating away at my company's product, brand, profitability. We need to get to the bottom of it, and she commissioned the study. So with that, I would like to invite you, Monica, to come up and share the report with us.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. So we're going to share really nice and interesting stories this morning regarding illicit markets. And an illicit market sometimes, and here talking in the US, we might think is not touching us in any way. And I'm going to ask you if you have ever had the opportunity to have an illicit alcoholic beverage. Immediate question is, of course not. I wouldn't drink that. Maybe you have and haven't realized. Or maybe you have had, let's say, a beer or a spirit which is smuggled and you don't realize. So this is not just the case Mostly illicit markets are prevalent in emerging countries, but it's not the case all the time. So for example, in the UK, of the percentage of the imported beer, we have a smuggling problem. 1 out of 9 or 1 out of 10 beers can have a smuggling problem in the UK. Why? Because of price differential differences and taxation between the different countries. So maybe if you go to an emerging country and you go to a bar, maybe that beverage that you can have, you don't realize, can be counterfeited. And that can happen anywhere in the world. And we can see earlier this year, 100 people died in Indonesia because some alcoholic beverage had methanol, which is the bad stuff in a spirit. So we're talking about here not just fiscal risks, but health risks. And it's, good public policy should take into account all these risks that are involved. And I would like to start the presentation now. Oh. I think this is not, this is your original one.
I should have done that, shouldn't I? It's right here. Ta-da.
Perfect. Okay, here we go. Okay, so why is AB InBev doing this? Because we're very interested in an elephant, huge elephant that is in this room that nobody speaks about. So we talk about, public policy. We talk about, we're experts knowing, the size and shape and dynamics of the illicit markets. We know who likes Budweiser. Why is Stella Artois favorite beer around the world for premium markets? We know a lot about the licit markets, but we don't know a lot about the illicit markets, which sometimes, for example, we have a very large operation in African countries, and as you can see as of results of the study, more than 40% or 40% on average is illicit. So we understood that we have to understand the size and shape of these markets to be able to collaborate with the government and to know, what is our industry composed of. And we have a really large competitor, which is illicit in this case. So I'm going to refer to 3 things today. One is definitions. What is illicit alcohol and what are the categories? Then the size and shape. How big is it? What are we talking about in value terms? And then what is the root cause of it? And what can we do about it? So first one, definition. What is illicit alcohol? Illicit alcohol is basically alcohol that is out of the formality. That it can be, for example, alcohol that doesn't have sanitary registration, or that is not paying taxes, or that is not following, for example, the rules and the restrictions or the regulations that a country or that a city or that a state has for alcoholic beverages. And then we measure illicit in 3 different metrics. We take into account in volume. So because we couldn't compare apples, we have to compare apples to apples. We make a measure in hectoliters, LAE, which is a liter of alcohol equivalent. So we are able to compare beer to spirits, and then we can mix them all together and we can have a consistent base to compare. Then we have the value. What is the size of the value in US dollars? So we can see if we have this table full of illicit counterfeited whiskey, then we can say, for example, we have $1,000 in whiskey here of retail value of illicit. But if we paid licit, it can be 2 or 3 times more the value of this market. So there's a big difference between the value of illicit and the value of licit. And finally, the fiscal loss. We calculate the fiscal loss, and we consider there's a really large pool of value for the governments and for fiscal authorities around the world in losses on the illicit trade. And sometimes for top countries, if we have the opportunity to measure that and collaborate with the government, saying, look, for example, we have countries in which there is a really large important of the market, which is tax leakage. Okay, let's work with the government. Instead of pushing more regulations and more restrictions, why don't we work together to lower the level of the illicit market, and then it's a win-win for society, it's a win for the illicit companies, and of course it's a win for the government. We started looking at what are we talking about when we're talking about illicit alcohol, and sometimes it was difficult because we had some people that said, oh, there are many different products around the world, so we categorize them all, and here is this is the 5 categories that you see right now are already world standard. So when we talk about, for example, contraband, we know what we're talking, that is an important part of this categorization. So we have 5 categories. The first one is counterfeit. Counterfeit is the fake alcohol, sometimes, for example, refills. So, for example, there's a very expensive bottle of very expensive whiskey. It's refilled with cheap whiskey in the bottle that is the real McCoy bottle. So that's one. The other one is when they produce fake brands that they don't have sanitary registration, they don't pay any taxes, is included here. Or, for example, when there is infringement of intellectual property rights. For example, in the case of China, we have a big case of counterfeiting of our beer, which is Budweiser. So we can see there's a very important penetration of our beer in China, huge market. But we have the consumers, they have Budweiser, but they have also Bullweiser, Budweiser, you name it. So very, very different types of beers that are very similar to us, but it's not our beer. So that carries 2 things, again, the health risk and also, of course, the fiscal risk. And it's a product which is completely outside of the range of the illicit market. So that's the first one, counterfeit. The second one is contraband. Contraband is when a product gets into the country without paying customs duties, VAT, and the customs duties, all the taxes. And we have contraband or smuggling of 2 things. So one is the final product, which Jeff mentioned through free trade zones, very typical there are nodes in the world that there are the places for excellence to distribute smuggled products, but also the smuggling of the raw material, which is ethanol. Ethanol, which is the ethylic alcohol, is the raw material for spirits. So it is very easy for us if we want to set, a factory of illicit alcohol, of illicit spirits, then we just have to buy ethanol, then put a little bit of flavor, then, put some, depending on the level of concentration of the ethanol, but we're ready to sell illicit alcohol. And so any country that has warm weather, that produces, for example, sugarcane, you can easily tell that they have a large production of ethanol. And in this country, most probably, 2 things might happen if it's an emerging country, is either they have that country has a big production of counterfeited beverages, or is a good exporter of ethanol. And we've seen, for example, interesting, crazy world trade stories is ethanol produced in China that ends up in African countries at really low prices. So can you believe for ethanol being produced in China end up in Africa for an illicit beverage and still be profitable even though it's sold at very, very low prices? So that's the other part of smuggling. So that's those. So we have 2, counterfeit, contraband. The third one is illicit artisanal. Illicit artisanal is the artisanal beverages that we have all over the world, but then when they become commercialized and when they are sold in very large quantities for trade, and they are fully designed not for just home food consumption, or we have a little party or there's a wedding. No, these illegal artisanal are artisanal beverages. For example, in the case of Peru, there's some artisanal and local beverage that is called chicha de jora. Okay, when that becomes big time trade, or in many stores and in towns and everything, and they don't pay taxes, they don't have any sanitary registration, and they're outside the legal world, that's illicit. So that's the third one. Fourth one, surrogate. And this is really surprising. Around the world, people are still drinking cologne. They drink antiseptic, pharmacy alcohol. So there are countries, for example, Eastern European countries. In the case of Latin America, a third of the illicit market in El Salvador is this surrogate alcohol. So people go to a pharmacy, which is an additional a way of distributing alcoholic beverages, mostly for underage or people with drinking problems. And I can go to a pharmacy in El Salvador and say, can I have some illicit, not illicit, can I have some alcohol? And then the question from the person selling is, do you need it for pharmacy alcohol, for robbing alcohol, or for drinking? And if I say for drinking, I can get my little bottle, either just pure ethanol, or I can have it ready to drink in a little bag, plastic bag, transparent plastic bag, which is like a ethyl alcohol with like Kool-Aid and with some drops of color. And very, very cheap, out of any restriction or regulation, or out of any control from the government. And actually that is one distribution channel for alcoholic beverages in the case of El Salvador, some Eastern European countries in which there is not rule of law governing the ethanol control. And then the last one, tax leakage, is the beverage that is not paying taxes. So it is the real thing, but it's not paying taxes. It happens a lot with domestic production of spirits. So for example, there is a local spirits company that produces the whole thing legal. It has sanitary registration. It's paying formal taxes and everything. But when they pass to the final market one bottle, then on the back door there's another bottle, which is nobody's gonna die, nobody's gonna get blind because of drinking that bottle. But that bottle is not paying consumption taxes. It's not paying any taxes at all. So those are the 5 categories. Examples here. Depending on the country, we can have countries where it has, more contraband or more counterfeit, or as I mentioned, for example, surrogate alcohol. When there is no regulation, and we found around the world, we've made more than 50 studies. We commissioned a company called Euromonitor International. And that's the company that measures and that is behind all these studies. And what we can see is that in countries where there is, for example, in the case of surrogate or counterfeited beverages, are countries in where there is no regulation on ethanol control. More than 85 years ago, prohibition was lifted here in the U.S. You remember? I hope you don't remember, because I think none of us were here. But it was 1933 in which prohibition was lifted, and it was a long process for being now today sitting here, and we're able to say here in the U.S. there is a very good control of the ethanol. There is a very good control of alcoholic beverages in this country. So it is not because it came out of the blue that we don't have large, we don't have an important market of illicit alcoholic beverages here in the U.S. It's because there are rules, and the rules are enforced. And this is the path we want the emerging countries. Some of them are closer, some of them are very far away, to go to the same path to see what works and what doesn't work, and how private companies can contribute with ideas. We know the market, we know the drivers, we know the consumers. Then we can sit together to fight this big elephant which we have in the room. So size, shape, and dynamics. If I go to the doctor and I have a fever, then the doctor will start asking me questions, and maybe he's gonna send me to make some labs or some X-rays or whatever. If I need an appendix operation, if the doctor doesn't make the good questions and ends up putting a cast on my finger, this is not going to fix my appendix, and eventually I'm going to die. So what we want to know this, and we want, to partner with the governments, is when we want to fix a problem, we want to know what's wrong. And the only thing to know what's wrong is to ask the questions and try to measure and to see what's going on in these illicit markets. This is why we feel it is really important to measure the size, shape, and dynamics of the market. As I told you before, in the last years, we've been we've started this effort, and this is really interesting because this is part of our corporate affairs teams all over the world. I'm based in New York, where our global headquarters are for InBev, and we have a lot of topics to cover in our everyday regulatory, corporate affairs life, and this is a small part of our everyday business. But what we found is that even though it's a small part, it is a very, very important part for a lot of countries where we operate. And we cannot ignore that this problem is affecting us and is affecting, the formal industry, is affecting the consumers. Consumers are dying. Consumers are, getting blind because of the consumption of illicit alcoholic beverages. And nobody seems to put all these numbers and data together to say, okay, what can good public policy be, taking into account all these considerations? So we've made nearly 50 studies around the world for many years in some countries. For example, in the case of Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, we've made 6 studies in the last 6 years. So we've been following each and every year what happens in these countries and what, for example, if there's a raise of customs duties, what happens with the illicit market. If there is more control, what happens when there is a restriction introduced? Or, for example, when the government seeks to control in some way one of these categories, what happens? What is good and what is bad? What works and what doesn't? And we made this whole study together, and these are the results. So 26 of all the countries around the world that we studied, that's Latin America, Africa, and Eastern Europe. We still have to make, and it would be very interesting, to see what happens in China and India. And my guess is that it's going to be very similar to any other emerging country. We will see very similar characteristics. 1 out of 4 bottles, as Jeff said, in the world is illicit, and in volume. If we see in value, of course, because the most important driver of these illicit markets is price. So, of course, the value is lower. So 14% of the total value of the world market is illicit. And there is a pool of value of $3.6 billion around the world of potential fiscal income that the governments are losing because of illicit alcohol. If we see by region, and this is really interesting, of course, this is an average. We see Latin America 15, but of course, we're not taking into account, for example, countries like Brazil, or for example, countries very large in Latin America like Mexico, they have lower levels of illicit alcohol. So we see here, for example, in the case of Africa, a very high average, which is 40%. That is almost half of all the alcoholic beverages in Africa is illicit, and Eastern Europe is 27. Beer, and this is important. Why are we doing this? If beer, beer is a cheap product, like individually, 1 bottle of beer is not worth to have a fake beer, and if we get a little bit deep into the production process, it's very expensive to produce a fermented product. To produce beer, you have to have a brewing process, which is to put it, to produce it in at industrial level. The capex, it's really high compared to producing spirits. With the spirits, we can easily, all of us get together and we can produce some really nice counterfeited spirits in this room, we cannot do that for beer. So why we interested in this? We can see that just 2.3% of the alcoholic, of all the alcoholic beverages around the world, just 2.3 is illicit beer. But we're convinced that we have the responsibility to see what's going on in our industry, and again, to measure this. Even though we're not a big participant as beer, we're part of the alcoholic beverages sector, and this is the alcoholic beverages sector, there is a really large market, as I said before, of illicit beverages. So here is Latin America, and we can see very large differences within the different countries. I mentioned, for example, the case of Mexico is 15%, but we can see other cases, Dominican Republic, 30%, 31%, Ecuador nearly 30%, Peru 26%. So we can see a lot of different shapes. And then what is the difference, for example, between Dominican Republic with 31% and let's say a country like Nicaragua or Panama with 2%, or Nicaragua with 4.6%. What are the Panamanians and what are the people from Nicaragua or the authorities or the industry or the consumers, what are they doing different as compared to the Dominicans? Are they drinking different rum, or they're different people, same crazy Latin American people in both countries? So what is going on, or what is the difference? And the big difference is on one part, and it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but it's a mixture of good public policy, good enforcement, consumer awareness, the players or the situation, the country, for example. We see some countries in where there's a lot of criminal activity, money laundering, in which that is combined with these illicit markets. So, for example, unfortunately, for example, in the case of Colombia, we see in the illicit alcoholic beverages, we see also being combined with money laundering coming from drug exports. So we can see a combination of factors, and this is where we see there is a very diverse market and shape within the illicit alcoholic beverages, in this case in Latin America. And this is very interesting. If we see from the regional point of view, which is the largest category? And we see largest category, if you see on top of the graph, is smuggling. So if we want to fix the illicit alcohol problem in Latin America, we have to first look at the smuggling. Not necessarily in all countries, but for example, we can see if we want to fix the problem in Honduras, 91% of the problem is smuggling. So we're doing a good business there if we control the smuggling. But for example, I mentioned before Salvador, 1/3 of the problem is surrogate. Remember surrogate, people drinking ethanol? So if we control upstream the problem of surrogate, and if we control the consumption of this, and it's very, very low-hanging fruit, easy public policy to say, how do we control ethanol? And it's very easy. I remember we were looking, which are the best ways to control the consumption of ethanol. And sometimes in the beginning, the solution was put some drops of methanol so people won't drink it. And if somebody drank it, they would die. And that was initially, when prohibition was lifted, one of the measures that was done here in the US is to put methanol to the ethanol, so it made it poisonous, so people wouldn't drink it because they would die or get bland. So that's not very healthy public policy. But then there are very interesting and easy ways to control the consumption of ethanol, is put some drops of color. There is something called denaturing of the ethanol. So all ethanol that is not meant for human consumption here in the US, in Europe, in Mexico, this ethanol has some drops of this denaturing agent, which makes it really bad. It has like a vomiting effect. It tastes horrible. it has a color. In some countries' regulation, it has a color. So, you know, it's very easy and a way to control ethanol. So all ethanol that is not meant for human consumption, and there's a huge market, you know, for the industry of cosmetics, you know, pharmaceutical industry, paints, you name it. There are a lot of products that use ethanol. Ethanol for petrol, for the cars, etc. It's the same ethanol, it's ethylic alcohol. So if we put these little drops and we put, for example, warnings, in the case of Panama, for example, is really, really low the level of illicit alcohol, non-consumption of surrogate. Why? There's a regulation there in which you go to store and you find pharmacy alcohol. You find it, one is tinctured, the other one, the labels, you know, on label, they have like a skull, like a skeleton. It has a color. So the product is not clear. It is either blue or purple, and it tastes horrible. I've tried it. You know, I've tried many things, and some of them are horrible, but some of them are really good, and you don't even realize you're drinking bad stuff. So if you see the medicine for the disease in these countries is completely different. In the case, for example, of Dominican Republic, we see 64% of smuggling. So if I was part of the Dominican Republic government, I would think, first of all, I have to fix is a border control, right? And so on. So now, in the case of Africa, we see much higher levels, unfortunately. We can see, for example, countries like Mozambique, 73%, Zambia, almost 70%. So again, if we're going to see, okay, how are we going to regulate and how are we going to think about making these market healthier, we have to think, okay, what's going on in Zambia to have a 70% level of illicit alcohol? Really interesting, South Africa, 14.5, and they've been controlling ethanol. They've been controlling, for example, the borders. There is a very good example of things to do to have such lower levels of illicit in South Africa. And they have one of the lowest in Africa right now. Again, regionally, 43% is illicit artisanal. So we have these traditional beverages that are consumed in mostly all African countries, but we can see, for example, in other countries like Tanzania, this illicit artisanal is 88%. So it is mostly all of the illicit market in Tanzania. It is composed of this illicit artisanal. Same case as in Latin America. In the case of Eastern Europe, we have the case of Czech Republic and Russia. There has been, we were talking earlier about the effort that the Russian government is doing to curb harmful consumption of alcohol in Russia, and understanding that there is a very high level of illicit alcohol. Then the government can say, okay, we have to fight two things. We have to fight, first of all, a very high level of harmful consumption in the country, but at the same time, a very high level of illicit alcohol. And that is very tricky, because then if I want to control the consumption, harmful consumption of alcohol, I might have unintended consequences and maybe boost or reduce, in this case, the illicit alcohol in Russia. Russia has a high level of surrogate consumption, also a high level of counterfeited, and very interesting, very high quality counterfeited alcoholic beverages. So from the public health point of view, it's affecting not negatively because most people are going to die, but because there's a very high consumption, level of consumption of counterfeited alcoholic beverages in Russia, but the quality is fairly good. So we have a lesser, health, if I could say, health risk in Russia, but of course, huge tax leakage, huge consumption of surrogate alcohol, and it's a fight that the government is doing, implementing, the most comprehensive and the most thoughtful strategy to control this market, taking into account into account that whatever they do, it can backfire into a very high level of illicit. So here we see Czech Republic. Czech Republic is one of the countries with the highest consumption of alcohol. But interestingly enough, it has a lower level of illicit compared to other neighboring countries, and of course compared to Russia. And of course, in this case, for example, we can see there is a very important affordability. So the price gap between the licit market and the illicit market is really short. This is what we want to achieve. So what do we want to avoid? It's markets where illicit alcohol is very, very low in price, and then licit is so high that nobody can buy it. So we want to close this gap, and this is a very good case, like in the case of Czech Republic, in which that has been achieved in a very interesting way. Okay, so this is the third part, drivers. Okay, what are the drivers, and what is going on in each country to say, okay, how can we control that, and what is the root cause of this problem? So first one, price. Of course, you know, price gap, I was mentioning, the gap between the price of licit and illicit. If we make the price higher for the illicit players, and if we make such a strong control over ethanol, for example, ethanol flows, then the ethanol flow, which is the raw material of all the counterfeited stuff, goes up, then the price of illicit goes up. And then the really intelligent entrepreneurs of illicit will say, well, you know, it is not very interesting because the price of illicit is really high, and then the next affordable product is really low, so the price gap is really small. So there will be a lot of, for example, contraband. If I have to do a lot of corruption and pay the police at the borders and the customs and everything, I have to go through too much hustle to have such a little profit. So basically, if we push up the price of illicit, and if we push down or leave as it is the price of illicit, the price gap will close and we'll have more illicit market. So in this case, we have to close the gap. Picture here is part of a campaign we did with the Ecuadorian authorities regarding awareness of the illicit alcohol market. Like 5 years ago, 58 people died in Ecuador from one party. It was a wedding where they served some counterfeited stuff, and in the wedding, including bride and groom, drank this alcoholic beverage, and they sadly died. And they haven't noticed that it was because of the counterfeited beverage. The day after it was the funeral, people kept on drinking this alcoholic beverage, and people died. So they were like, that was completely crazy. And this is, this was a really sad wake-up call for the Ecuadorian authorities, and there was a very good alliance with the public. With the public authorities, both police, the fiscal authorities, the Ministry of Industry, Production, etc. And there was this campaign of raising awareness that sometimes, if you drink something that you're not supposed to drink, it can kill you. And in some countries, we were talking earlier on today that people used to have, for example, a person that knew somebody that was a smuggler, but a trustable smuggler. So you could get good stuff. You don't have to pay the customs duty. So good, interesting price for the whiskey for the wedding, but you're not going to die of it. Or, for example, why pay more? Or why do you have to pay taxes? Why do you have to be stupid and pay more for some product when you can buy it somewhere else cheaper? So this is like an awareness campaign in the case of Ecuador. Strong consumer preferences and low awareness. And this is very important because people don't know what they're drinking. So this is an example of what we did in the case of Colombia, a campaign called LACRA, which is Licores Adulterados de Colombia. it's a humorous campaign saying, look at that guy. So he's the manager of the company saying, you know, I produce the best alcohol in the world, and it's full of rats, and nobody cares about health issues. Please buy from me because I sell really cheap stuff. And that was a very interesting campaign. Also, you know, it's an alliance between public authorities, private sector, and raising awareness of these health and fiscal risks that have this illicit market. In this one, of the low awareness and also strong consumer preference, as I said before. The only way to fix that is understand what we're doing right now, understand the size, shape, and also the dynamics of these illicit markets. Another one is inadequate legal and regulatory framework. Again, the example I was giving, if I need an appendix surgery, if I get a cast on my arm, that's not going to fix my problem with the appendix. So when we're going to diagnose what is the problem, first know, you know, what is the root cause. And in this case, for example, I don't know if you heard, there is a big wave of compulsory fiscal marking systems around the world, saying, you know, for example, if I go to the government and say the best way to fix your fiscal deficit in a country which is suffering, and most of our emerging countries are in need of fiscal income. And then, so to fix that, to fix the illicit market, we can mark each and every bottle of beer or of spirits, and then your fiscal income will go up. Since, I think, for 2 years now, we have a fiscal marking system in Ecuador. Last year, there were 735 million bottles marked. Each and every bottle has a little stamp on it, making sure we're paying the proper taxes. And that system, of course, is very, very expensive, but is not bringing any positive outcomes for the fiscal authorities. Why? Because that is marking or controlling a sector that is already in line paying the appropriate taxes. So what happens is that it's pushing the price of the illicit market up, and then pushing the price, of course, of the illicit market down, because it's you know, the price gap is the most important part of these analysis. And for example, in the case of beer, 99.5% of the beer that is produced in Ecuador is legal and is paying the proper taxes. And so they're marking us, in the case of Ecuador, each and every bottle, you know, and we have the system. We're not paying for it, the government is paying for it. So this is not, you know, it doesn't make a lot of sense for a government to pay for a very, very expensive system that is completely useless, disproportionate. And so we say, okay, why don't you spend these millions of dollars a year in an effective way to control the illicit market? Because this is, as we saw, you know, we've been seeing this system for 2 years now, and even though we're not paying for it, you know, it is not very positive for us, and it's not very positive for the country for paying such expensive system, which can cost between $15 and $20 million per year for a company, like for controlling one company, that the government can very much use. There are very other alternatives to use the money to control this illicit market. Oh, here we've had, in the case of Peru, I think it is the country that has the most experience and on what to do and what not to do. And I think the path that Peru is going through a series of regulations regulations controlling ethanol. Peru has a table in which they're seated public sector, private sector, the police, the customs, everybody looking, and also society and consumers also looking for the best alternative to control illicit markets. They're going through a very interesting path, and of course that goes through includes also, of course, awareness campaigns and very interesting public policy options that have been very positive for the Peruvian market. And I think we have a lot to learn from Peruvian case. Last but not least, other two is we can have a very, very good public policy, but if we don't enforce it, it doesn't exist. So maybe in some countries we have, for example, regulation controlling ethanol, or very interesting 21st century regulation controlling and regulation on the paper for controlling, for example, hours of sale hours, or for example, dry laws on Sundays, or for example, trying to control consumption from minors. But if there is no enforcement, that regulation is completely useless. So one is lack of enforcement, and the other one is poorly regulated channels. In the last years, online sales are completely out of proportion. Very good logistics for delivering illicit stuff around the world, and this includes in some cases, for example, in the U.S. Online, or for example, when some underage, they ask for online, they buy online alcoholic beverages. There's the person that is going to the house or to the apartment to deliver the goods. They have to check the ID and everything. Sometimes this checking process is not duly made, or is not it's not taken as seriously as it should, and so we have a big problem of online sales as well. So those are the drivers, enablers, and solutions that we see that from the public policy point of view, and from the collaboration between the public and private sector, they can easily control this illicit market. Illegal alcohol is the worst form of harmful consumption of alcohol. So from the alcohol consumption, there is some people that drink, in excess alcohol, but if that is illicit, it's twice as bad as normal harmful consumption of alcohol. And what we're convinced is that there is, when the government is designing public policy in a country, for example, like Mozambique, that has 70% of market share of illicit, if the government decides to establish a public policy, let's say either taxes or regulations, in which they don't take into account the 70% of illicit alcohol, then there's going to be a problem. So our call for action here is that we have this information, we want to share it with the governments, we want to share it with society, we want to raise awareness of this problem, and we're convinced, as Jeff was saying, like if we want to have, if we want to combat informality, illicit markets around the world, and be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, then we have to address these illicit markets, mostly in emerging countries, in a more aggressive way, as we've done in the past. What are we going to do? What are we doing about this? And as you can see, we're raising awareness. This is exactly what I'm doing with you right now at the moment. We want to share knowledge and insight, I'm sure, and it's not very applicable here in DC. We're sitting and we're not going to find a bar in the corner where you're going to find some illicit stuff, but I'm sure your level of awareness of this illicit market is raised. This happens not just on alcoholic beverages, but on each and every product. You see, clothing, pharmaceuticals, people, for example, in a cancer treatment or looking for an antibiotic. And it's criminal for these people to be producing these, fake pharmaceuticals, which are going to, harm society in a really, really nasty way. You see, illicit markets around the world in each and every category of production. They're there, they're prevalent. In this case, it's illicit alcohol, but it can be any other product that has a high tax, that is highly regulated, or that is expensive, and it doesn't have to have any regulations, sophisticated regulations on top. For example, jewelry. Gucci bags, you name it. It can help a lot to see what are the dynamics and what is the size and shape. And just to end this conversation with you, to open the conversation right now, is that we want to be a progressive partner. So we want to work with the governments and say, if we sit together and we want to control this big elephant, let's look at the topic in a holistic way, and we're more than happy to share these results. These studies are done by Euromonitor International. Again, it's a third party. It's a company that has a lot of experience measuring both licit and illicit markets, and the insight that these studies they give. And there's a lot of detail, the price gaps, what happens with the market when a policy, and a specific policy is introduced, what happens to the market, what can be good public policy, what are good results, and what are, for example, in some cases, we've tried to control it in the case of illicit alcohol on the mom-and-pop stores. And we worked with, for example, in the case of Peru, with the police. And we went to the store, and it was closed. It was closed for 15 days. Then it was open again. And again, it was, of course, selling, along with our beers, the illicit stuff at daylight. So we have to think about policies that protect our communities, but also protects the mom-and-pop stores, and of course, it protects the fiscal income, which is very much needed in our countries. With this, I finish. We've been very active in social media. We want to raise awareness of this problem, and I want to get you as ambassadors of this fight against illicit trade in the best way possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. Thanks for navigating us through a really interesting report. This report, the materials, some of the campaigns, the ad campaigns that Monica mentioned, those are available on our website. And I think at the bottom of the program is the web address where you can find all those materials, fact sheets, everything. So it's really, I really appreciate having your expertise. Clearly you're on the ground too, fighting against this problem. We've built into the program an opportunity to ask her some questions, but I'm going to keep moving forward. We lost a little bit of time this morning because of the rain delay. And I've invited Leonard McCarthy to come up and share an initial reaction to the report. Now, wherever you are, Leonard, come on up. Some of you may know Leonard, actually. He's in his days when he was with the World Bank and was headed up the anti-corruption and integrity work there. And I thought it'd be interesting to have his first perspective. You can actually stay right here. Because of the intersection between illicit trade and these other evils of money laundering, corruption, anti-integrity. So if you wouldn't mind sharing your initial thoughts, we'd appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Good morning. You use that word evils, you scare me. Just thinking back 2 years ago, I was talking to my wife about this word serendipity over the weekend. But 2 years ago, we had an event at the World Bank on illicit financial flows on the same day. That's just before the elections. And I made some startling recommendations on what will happen. And so 2 years later, we have an event about illegal trade, Jeff. So if you want to know what's going to happen tomorrow, you can just talk to me. Jeff's got my number. I'm a good prognosticator. So, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a professor from Bermuda at Jesus College in London in 2009. I made a speech, and so, the British like to ask questions. So after the speech, he asked me, do I know the difference between illicit and illegal? And I said, I don't know, we just use the terms. He said, well, illegal is against the law, and illicit is the name of a dog. So Jeff, illicit is the name of a dog. But I see, I read up about the term a little bit, in preparing for this comments to Monica's excellent presentation. Let me just take you back because, I'm a former prosecutor, and you never really leave those jobs, do you? You become something else, but you stay a prosecutor in your heart. The first time I heard about illicit trade or illegal trade or encountered it I was at a conference in London, Commonwealth Conference on money laundering. And I heard this term, the hawala. And I thought, what is hawala? It was a euphemistic term to describe something a little bit more serious. And then when I was in South Africa a few years later, that was 1997, so around about 2000, we worked with the US government, with the Secret Service, to investigate something called black dollars scams, because the Secret Service is responsible for protecting the authenticity of the currency. And that went a little bit into Africa. A number of people ended up in court, but I saw another face of illicit trade. And then, I don't know whether there's anyone here from cigarette companies, tobacco companies. They are very advanced with their intelligence. You'd be surprised. They came to see me a few years later whilst I was also in South Africa, and they opened my eyes to the fact that a ship that left from Guangzhou in China that were carrying fake cigarettes was also the same ship that was carrying a consignment of cocaine. So just to tie in with what Jeff said earlier, you have the same players, the same routes, the same methodology, the same agents, the same trading patterns. And then finally, a few years later, we worked with authorities in the UK because we were targeting a smuggling network that were providing authentic-looking stamped visas from Britain. And then again, I saw how those things are linked to illicit trade. I'm telling you this because I think it's quite serious. We look at things like human trafficking, drugs, murder, corruption, and we tend to think this is not always so bad. I was reading over the weekend that in Italy, 80% of the cocaine trade is still controlled by the mafia. On the other side, the African Development Bank reports that 42% of people in Africa still live below the poverty line. So, I think it's always good to look at what experts tell us about this, and the experts that I consult are of the view that the commodities of illegal trade, namely consumables, counterfeits, vehicles, drugs, arms, and minerals, are directly linked to poverty and security. It's always good to go back to history. If you look at history, you see, and I'm not an economist or a philosopher or a researcher, but my little bit that I read up says that if you have a financial crisis, it could lead to chaos in trade and finance, which in turn can promote a political upheaval and a small dose of populism, and that can in turn lead to conflict and state failure. So it's a little bit more serious than what we tend to acknowledge. And I think central to all of that is the problem of corruption and corrupt influence. I've been doing this kind of work for a better part of 20 years, and that's why I really want to commend Jeff and TRACIT and Euromonitor and AB InBev for this very meaningful initiative. I read the report. It's quite a sobering picture that they paint. Those of you who specialize in illicit trade or in studying the phenomena will tell us that illicit trade lives in the shadow of corruption. It feeds off three things: anonymity, collusion, and a promise to either pay off or pay back. So what these criminals do is they really hijack the economy of a country. They They create a parallel system, they abuse the international financial system, and they cripple the revenue stream at home. And so you can look at a number of countries. I don't want to mention names. It's Monday morning, so I don't want anyone to feel bad. But if you look at certain countries in Africa, in Central America, even Latin America, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, you can just see, you know, the enabling role of corruption and illicit trade. I do want to say something very briefly about the report. Otherwise, Monica will say he came to speak here and he hasn't even read the report. But I did. So what struck me most about the report is the size of fiscal losses associated with the you know, with the illicit alcohol trade. It's much more serious than what I initially thought. And I think those findings and estimates may actually very well be on the conservative side. I also think the report is correct in deducing that this notion of social acceptability is one of the big factors that dilutes the public understanding of the real effect of illicit trade. Many of us come from developing countries, and I'm sure you will agree with me when I say that people on the street don't always regard this as serious enough. Many of them also ask, how can I benefit from this? Well, I can actually benefit from this. So why is it such a big deal? And I think one of the things, Jeff, that TRACIT could definitely look into is how do we change that narrative in the minds of the public? Because I think we've struggled to persuade people to believe that illicit trade actually seriously affect their lives. I also agree with the conclusion that higher taxes on manufacturing of illicit products can only end up stimulating the demand for illicit products. It's just a fact of life. I know that tax experts might agree about this, but we can't tax ourselves out of trouble. We cannot tax ourselves out of social and behavioral trouble, and we can't legislate against greed in every conceivable way. I think the report is also correct in isolating the role or the lack of law enforcement collaboration, for those of us who come from that background, and poorly regulated distribution channels. Just thinking off the cuff, I think some of the solutions lie in revamping licensing, looking at market access, looking at laws and regulations on trading, reselling, and pricing. Those are the things that fuel the supply side of the problem. And then innovative ways of incentivizing the illegal to become legal. You know, I think Einstein said that intellectuals solve problems, geniuses prevent them. So we need to look at how we can actually prevent, you know, I'm all for law enforcement and an aggressive stance, but I think to study this thing a little bit in more detail and incentivizing the illegal to become legal might be part of the solution. Jeff invited me here because I'm supposed to be an internationalist, so let me say something about the international level. It's interesting that many people regard illicit trade as a subset of illicit financial flows. But the fact is, whatever terminology you like or prefer, most policymakers acknowledge the inextricable link between financial market integrity and illicit trade. And I think for those of you who engage with them, it's important that we engage, you know, and take this message to them and take advantage of that opportunity. There is an institution here in Washington, D.C. called Global Financial Integrity, and they produce a lot of analysis and material, and their estimation is that illicit financial flows amount to something close to $1.1 trillion US. Again, it gives you a sense of the scope of the problem. On the United Nations side, I think, as Jeff said, it is encouraging that they have embedded the importance of illicit trade in into the fiber of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's again something we should say there's a step change here that we can latch onto and take advantage of. The World Bank, where I worked, came together with other international organizations in a place called Addis Ababa in 2015 at a Finance for Development conference. There was a lot of momentum then because of the Panama Papers and because of the London conference. And so sometimes people get nudged into a particular direction, but you know, to a surprise of many, the board of the World Bank approved a very, very progressive policy on building illicit financial flows into their policy and country analysis. Now, you know, the thing with people, most people, is you need to hold us accountable and say, okay, so you said this, are you actually doing it? The IMF is the managing director there is very progressive. She has recently, and I don't understand it because I'm from a small town, but she tried to connect the abuse of what is termed crypto assets and how it could be linked to money laundering and terrorist financing. Again, there's an openness and a sort of an attitude to look at illicit trade with a fresh set of eyes. Here in the US, just because I'm from law enforcement background, I like the strong stance that the US has taken regarding intellectual property, because I think it's a substrata of this specific problem that you deal with. People steal other people's ideas, their products, they remake them, they fake them, and spread them around the world. I remember someone I spoke to many years ago said it all started with fake clothes, fake diamonds, and speakeasies. Now, people from the US will remember the speakeasies of the Depression era. Where we come from, we just call them shebeens. So I think it's important that the world strikes the right balance between analysis and action. I think these developments on the international front present a golden opportunity for the private sector, for those in the industries, for governments, non-governmental organizations, you know, to just ask, push the envelope, and hold one another accountable. Let me close with a few suggestions. I still don't think there is a better strategy than one designed to prevent the onset of illicit trade, prosecute and sanction the occurrence of these matters under what I would regard as uncompromised leadership in these institutions. The second thing I want to leave in your midst is this thing called sanctions. The World Bank, we had sanctions and we had a cross-debarment regime. And I know many countries have competition commissions and they have ways to issue administrative actions. And I wonder whether there's a way one could actually have a mutual recognition of those administrative decisions. Those who are interested on the enforcement side, my experience is that nothing is more effective than having financial intelligence centers, customs and excise, revenue investigators, specialists in trade, combine forces under a prosecution-driven and asset forfeiture strategy. Last 2 points, I think budget transparency can also lift the veil by showing where money and taxes are generated and spent, exposing trade gray zones and global business risk, which I think affect many businesses here, and provide us a better grip on the shape of the illicit economy. Let me then end to say on this wonderful Guy Fawkes Day, I think we need to go beyond borders and achieve what none of us or neither of us can do on our own. Chair, thank you very much. Thank you.